Thank you very much, Professor Todd Belt. Thanks so much for attending us here today, Foreign Press Correspondents Association.
My pleasure to be with you.
So let me do first a brief introduction so that everybody else can get to know you a little bit closer before we start with this interview.
Sure.
You are the director of the Political Management Program at the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University, based in Washington, D.C. Before joining GSPM, Dr. Bell was the John Klug Fellow in Digital Studies at the Library of Congress and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Hawaii in Hilo. His research and writing focuses on mass media, public opinion, the presidency, campaigns, and election. We have an election coming very soon, actually less than a month. This is the countdown, and we're going to focus the next conversation around that timing and everything else around your expert. You're also the co-author of 4 books. I will mention them briefly: The Post-Heroic Presidency, Leverage Leadership in an Age of Limits, The Presidency and Domestic Policy, Comparing Leadership Styles, PDR to Obama. We interrupt this newscast, How to Improve Local News and Win Ratings too, and Getting Involved, A Guide to Student Citizenship. So a lot of things we can talk about in the next half an hour. You also have published over a dozen chapters in edited scholarly books and over 2,000 scholarly articles as well. So Dr. Bell, again, welcome. Thank you very much for your time today. Let us start with some political context. We are less than a month, as we just mentioned, from the decisive midterm election in the US. And there are a lot of things going on so fast domestically, but also internationally. Where should we put our attention right now as foreign correspondents covering this country?
Okay, well, it's great to be with you and to talk to the Foreign Correspondents Association again. And I'm happy to chat about some of the stories that I think might go a little bit unknown first, and then we'll get to the big ones. So I think a real good place, if you're looking for a story about real meaning in these elections, is to look to the states. Obviously, we have a lot of state legislature races, many governorships coming up, and in many states, the people who are on the Supreme Courts, the state Supreme Courts, are also elected, or they're appointed by the state governor. And why are the states so important? Well, they're important in many ways because our system of government in the United States is broken up in half between the states and the federal government. The states have as much power as the federal government, but also because of things that are happening. Every 10 years, of course, we have the census. So the 2020 elections were very important for the processes of reapportionment and redistricting. Now, usually the 02, the 04, 06, and 08 usually go a little bit less noticed. But this one is really important this year because of the Dobbs decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade precedent for abortion and is now kicking the ability to set abortion law in the first trimester back to the states. So that means these state legislatures and governors and those judges, and there are even in some of these states that are referenda to change the state constitution one way or another on this issue. So if you really want to know more about this, because the power is going back to the states, it's important to look at those elections in the states there. So I think that's a really important underreported story to date, and that's something that I think is really important going forward. So don't forget the state elections. Those are really important. But of course, everybody's got their eyes on the big ones, the big federal elections. So we can talk a little bit about that. Let me start with the Senate elections. The Senate elections right now look like they could be a real toss-up or maybe even leaning towards the Democrats. And the reason for this is usually in the first term of a president's term in office, usually loses seats, usually about 26 in the House and usually a handful in the Senate. The Senate's now 50-50, so losing just one would mean that the Republicans would take over. This year, however, it's a little bit different. Our elections for the Senate are different than the elections in the House in that 1/3 of the Senate runs every 2 years. So not all 100 of those seats are up right now. There are actually 35 seats that are up this time, and 21 of them are Republican seats and 14 of them are Democratic seats. That means it's harder for the Republicans to get that majority because they have 3/5 of the seats that they need to defend all of them to take away one of those 14 seats that the Democrats have. So the Republicans need to protect all their own and then take away one from the Democrats. But something's happening. We have what we call our swing states. We know that most of these states are pretty secure for the Republicans. Many of them are pretty secure for the Democrats. So then we look at the key swing states that are going to be important. In one of them, the Republicans look like they're going to lose a seat. Right now, it looks like Pennsylvania is probably going to go Democratic, which is really unusual because Pennsylvania has been trending more Republican, but there is an election there between John Fetterman and Dr. Oz, the celebrity physician who is running there, and he hasn't been a very good candidate, so much so that some of the Republican money is being pulled out of that state and put in other places. So if the Republicans think that they're going to lose that, and they have a very good chance of losing it, then they have to pick up 2. And there are 4 other states that are sort of Democratic held states where they might be able to pick up some of those. Those are New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. In New Hampshire, the Democrats actually helped nominate the Republican who's running against Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire because the Republican there is a Trump loyalist, and Democrats thought that he would be the easiest one to beat, so they put some support behind him. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to do because you have to be careful what you wish for sometimes. But the Republicans look like they're not going to get New Hampshire. So now that means that they got to get 2 out of 3 seats that are really up there. So Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. Arizona's not looking so good for the Republicans. They have a chance there. And of course, we know what has been happening with Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate in Georgia. The Republicans have not given up on him because they need 2 of those 3 seats. And that's one of the reasons why they have stayed behind him and want to continue pushing him. So really interesting, the strategy that Republicans and Democrats have for the Senate. And, it could go either way. Just 1 seat. If the Democrats lose just 1 seat, like we would expect them to lose at least a couple during this year's election, then that can throw this off. Of course, the Senate is really important for the approval of federal judges, right? They approve the Supreme Court, but they also approve the lower courts as well. And so the issue of abortion is very big here too, because we can identify that a lot of the laws that might come out of those states that I was talking about earlier might get challenged in federal court. If the Democrats are able to hold on to the Senate, they will be able to get the judges that Joe Biden wants through the Senate and put onto the federal bench. If Mitch McConnell becomes the majority speaker with a Republican majority, then he will put a hold on all of the new judges. And so that will be a real interesting thing in terms of being able to stack the federal judiciary one way or another. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll stop there with
Perfect.
the Senate. Yeah.
Wonderful summarize to get, obviously an entire perspective of a lot of things that are going on in the same election on November the 8th. But before going back to some specific subjects that are on the table, like abortion and so many others that I would like to talk to you about this and which ones they are and what's the role they can play in this election. If we, before that, if we get a closer look into that states that you were mentioned, some specific examples, what can we say comparing this next coming election with anything else that happened before? Meaning, there is something that traditionally happens when there's a current administration or a presidency, then in the House or in the Senate, they lose that control, so that
Yes.
there can be like some kind of political game in that.
Right.
Is there any different context right now? What is happening and why?
Yeah, usually the president's party will lose an average of 26 seats, but it's been as high as 60 in the past. Obama lost close to 60 in 2010. And the reason for that is presidents cannot totally satisfy all of their constituents, and they lose popularity. The president's popularity is very closely tied to how things are going to go, but it's not always the case. We have had two recent exceptions to this rule where the president's party usually loses, and that is 1998, when people were very upset with the Republicans for impeaching then President Bill Clinton, and also in 2002, when people were rallying behind the Republicans and President George W. Bush after 9/11. So will this, with the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, be one of those outliers where it goes against the usual tradition? It very well could, because there has been a surge in voter registrations among young people, and especially young women. And each state does it differently. Not all states report which political party people are registering for, but in the states that do, we can see that they're registering much more Democratic than Republican. And so Democrats think that this could be a way that they can get more voter turnout, because when somebody registers to vote, they're usually guaranteed to vote that year that they register. So Democrats are hoping this can be one of those exceptions, and they can really turn the tide of the election in that way.
So in that sense, there's obviously a few subjects, as we mentioned before, that can play a key a role, let's say, in this next coming election. Abortion, of course, would be one of them. Why? But also economy, obviously, that's one of the main important issues that people consider before voting.
Always number one.
Always number one, especially now with high prices and inflation and everything happening due to the war in Ukraine. So can we tell more about those different subjects,
yes,
the role they are playing in this election, and why?
Yes, thank you. The economy is always the number one issue, and the economy isn't only inflation, of course. The economy is also unemployment. And unemployment is very good right now, which is something that's actually causing some of the inflation. And so the Democrats are going to want to talk about everybody's got a job and things are good from the unemployment standpoint. But inflation is in everybody's faces. When they go to the grocery store, or even when they're just driving down the street and they see those big numbers at the gas station, and there's no getting around it. Prices are going up. And no matter what you say to people, it's what they're actually paying and what they actually feel that matters most. And so there's no way to message around that. There's no way to campaign around it. You just have to sort of deal with it or tell people, you know, we're going to make things better. But ultimately, that's going to be number one. And that really works in the Republicans' favor. When we ask people in surveys which party they feel is better at handling inflation, most people will say the Republican Party. So this is a built-in advantage for the Republicans on this issue of inflation. So you have to think that that is going to really play into their hands and help them with that regular sort of tide going in their direction that we think. The other issue that Republicans have really wanted to use this election cycle has been the issue of crime, and particularly violent crime in the cities. These days, with our cell phones and everything, people are taking pictures of robberies and in grocery stores and convenience stores, and people bashing windows and running away with things. And that can be scary. And the images are very striking and very important. I'm sure most reporters know that images are very important. They tell a big story. And so that's another thing that Republicans are running on. However, they have a problem of their own there. The head of their party, Donald Trump, is now facing 5 different criminal investigations, especially for one down in Mar-a-Lago, where he, obviously, we have the videotape, was moving documents around after the subpoena. So it's difficult for a party to say that we are the party of law and order when the head of their party is under so many investigations. So that's going to be a little bit difficult one for them. The Democrats want to talk about Roe versus Wade. The Republicans do not want to talk about that. We've seen Republicans already scrub their websites of mentions of abortion. And we've seen a lot of people say, if they're running for governor, well, in our state it's legal, or in our state it's illegal, and there's nothing I can do about it. So they don't want to talk about it too much. Democrats want to use this to boost their turnout. Abortion used to be the issue that got Republicans to vote. Now it's getting Democrats to vote. Now, why is that? Because when you have something taken away from you, or when you perceive a loss, you're more likely to get activated and more likely to vote. So this is something that will reduce Republican voter turnout because they got what they want. And because Democrats had something taken away from them, this will inspire them. And we've seen this in a number of different elections. We saw a referendum in Kansas, and we also saw a couple of special elections in upstate New York and some others where we saw Democrats outperform what we expected. In other words, more Democrats were coming out to vote for them than we had otherwise seen. So those are some of the big issues. Republicans will also talk about immigration again. That's one of the big issues, one of the big social issues that they think plays into their hands. And some of their candidates last year were successful in talking about school issues, school choice, the issue of the books and what's being taught in the schools, the issues of masking and school openings, and how the schools responded to that. So that will be a big one for them. Democrats on the other side, they're going to want to talk about the things that Joe Biden has gotten done, such as the climate bill, which was called the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually doesn't do much about inflation, but actually does more about the climate. The infrastructure bill, which was never gotten done under Donald Trump. They always wanted to get it done. They never got it done. Biden got it done. Student loan forgiveness. This is something that's very powerful and important for young voters. Young voters really gave Joe Biden the White House. Democrats are trying to get them activated again this time around. And so then there's some other subsidiary issues that we'll see Democrats run on as well, in terms of, it depends upon their own district and their own state what some of those other issues will be.
And actually, because of all those reasons, for the first time since since President Biden became actually a president, his popularity is better, has improved a lot in recent weeks, and that can help also them maybe keeping control in the Congress. How can we also see that effect in different states? Because you mentioned abortion, immigration, and obviously some states are affected more for some subjects or some other ones. So how do you see that from your perspective, like both things together, something that in terms of the president can gain popularity and support, and other different issues happening very far away from Washington?
Yeah. Well, our old Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, said all politics is local, but I don't think that's quite the case as it was back then when everybody's on social media and paying attention to national politics. I think national politics is much more important. But there are still local issues that really matter. And as you mentioned, the abortion issue will play out differently in every state. We've seen a number of gubernatorial candidates, as I mentioned earlier, say, well, it's legal in our state or it's illegal in our state, and I have no intention of changing that. We have a couple of states putting it as a referendum on the ballots, and we'll expect much higher turnout there. So I think it's really going to play out different in the states, and I think that it can be used as it was in Kansas as something to really activate Democratic voters. At this point, it's something more that's going to energize Democratic voters than Republican voters. And this is something that I think a lot of Republicans are really worried about.
We've seen recently in years, not just in the US, but around the world, that political interests are always before, and usually, not always, but in general, are before people's interest, right?
Right.
We've seen recently that things have changed a lot in the US. We've been living, let's say, historic times. We have a very polarized country, probably more divided than ever before. You mentioned a few minutes ago, former President Trump. He is under investigation. with Department of Justice in the US, but still leading the political party. So what is his role and the role of Trump endorsed candidates in the next coming election?
Yeah, we've seen Donald Trump be very, very powerful in his endorsements in the primary section of the elections, and not quite as powerful at some of the state level elections. He lost a couple, his preferred candidate for governors lost in a couple of places, but it was almost like he had sort of the golden touch that whoever he wanted to support would be able to use his name to fundraise and to generate a lot more interest, media coverage, and volunteer base. But that's the primary elections. And the primary elections are much lower turnout than the general elections. And so these are elections where Republicans are running against one another. And the energy in the base of the Republican Party is the Trump part of the party. And so it's really not surprising that his preferred candidates would win, because it is his supporters that are more at the extreme wing of the party. In these lower these lower turnout elections, you're more likely to see the polar wings of the party turn out rather than the middle of the American electorate, because it is Republicans against Republicans and Democrats on Democrats. Now, this could be very detrimental, though, when it comes to the general election. People have gotten very tired of Donald Trump's lies about the 2016 election. The Mar-a-Lago instance, where he's being investigated for the documents, and his hotel was searched down there, and they took the documents away. That actually brought him back front and center in American politics, and allowed him to do what he likes to do, which is play the victim. And so now a lot of people are going to be voting in November based upon what they think about Trump on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, rather than what is going on. This is actually a benefit for Democrats. And the reason for that is usually a midterm election is a referendum on the incumbent president. But this makes it more of a choice election. Do you want to live in Biden's America, or do you want to live in Trump's America? Because all of these candidates that he supported are on the ballot. Some of them are very weak. He chose them just because they were loyal to him and would repeat his lies about the 2020 election. And many of them have turned out to be, in the words of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, weak candidates, not very strong candidates. Candidates like Mehmet Oz and Herschel Walker have not proved to be very good quality candidates, and may cost them the Senate. So this is Trump's effect has been very powerful up till now. It remains to be seen if it will carry through the election. Donald Trump has always seemed to found new voters every election, which is kind of interesting. He found a lot of new voters, a lot of white working class voters in 2016. He turned a lot of voters on from a lot of new Hispanic voters in 2020 during his election. Wasn't enough to give him the White House, but a lot of places actually went for him that we normally would think would go for Democrats. So it's not out of the range of thought that Trump could be very powerful in the primary election, but given the structure of our elections, it's less likely.
He actually, as we mentioned before, he's still leading the political party in so many ways, even with the silence of first, let's say, line political, Republicans. But my point here was that he's still leading the party, and he survived to so many different complicated situations, like 2 impeachments, other scandals, and now he's under investigation. But for now, he's considering running for the re-election.
Yes.
He didn't announce that, even if he anticipated his intentions to do that. He was not allowed, or what happened? Why could that be dangerous to know before midterm election?
Right. Well, there's a few things going on here. First of all, Donald Trump announced his intent to run for re-election the day after he was inaugurated in 2017. So why is he waiting so long now? Well, there's a couple reasons. Saying that he would run again is tantamount to admitting that he actually lost before. So that's part of it. And he doesn't like people to know that he lost. The other reason is he uses it to get back into the spotlight. And right now he still is in the spotlight. And people were thinking he was going to announce before the Mar-a-Lago search happened, but that put him back in the spotlight where he likes to be. And so he can wait until after the elections to announce if he wants to, which is when people normally announce, in order to generate more enthusiasm. You don't want to announce too early, because then people will stop giving you money and people will lose interest in you. You want to, what they say, peak just at the right time. You want to ramp up your interest, your campaign contributions, and your volunteer base in a way that is going to be there for the long run. And it is a long campaign, nearly 2 years for the presidency. So it does make sense for him to wait, especially since he's still in the news like he likes to be, and he's still getting the attention.
He didn't accept he lost the election, but a lot of other Republicans didn't either. Some of those candidates were endorsed by former President Donald Trump. What can you tell us, Professor, about the credibility of electoral institutions and liberal tendencies in the electorate if we consider there's some of these historic things happened for the first time recently?
Right. And a lot of people are really saying democracy is really what's on the ballot this time. And I think that's a really good point. Most of the Republicans who have been nominated for the House are election deniers. Now, we know that Donald Trump actually said to some people that he knew he lost. He just didn't want everybody to know that he lost. And that's something that's come out of the January 6th committee. But there are a lot of people who really still believe he didn't lose, or at least say that publicly. And what they will do at the state level or at the federal level to change laws to make it easier for someone who has lost to have it overturned. We've seen some laws like that happen in states like Georgia and Texas. That's really concerning. The inability to hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions is concerning. And we could see, if Republicans take the House, we could see them engage in a number of investigations of, say, Hunter Biden or other, things that they're trying to get back at Democrats just because of what happened to Donald Trump, and saying that he lost the election and it wasn't fair, and maybe investigating that. This has had the effect of really reducing people's support for our institutions of electoral democracy. People are more likely to think that elections are rigged or are somehow there's a lot more malfeasance in the casting and counting of ballots, which is not true. There's only been very, very little malfeasance that's happened, and coincidentally, it's been mostly on the Republican side, not on the Democratic side. So it's the ones who are talking about it who are the ones who are actually doing it. But we do see this as an illiberal tendency in the United States. We see people saying we're a republic, not a democracy, and that the willingness of the people in January 6th to replace the electors, to try to get rid of Mike Pence, to intimidate him into doing something that he knew was wrong. These are, tendencies towards authoritarianism in our country that are very, very concerning. And a lot of Democrats really think that, if we're going to put people in states and in the federal government who believe that the elections were rigged and don't believe in electoral institutions, then we really cease to be a democracy. Now, this isn't the only happening, these illiberal tendencies on the Republican side. We've also seen, some illiberal tendencies among Democrats, where we've seen some of the left wing of the Democratic Party really go out of their way to censor freedom of speech that they disagree with. The whole idea of cancel culture and canceling people if they say things that people think are inappropriate, engaging in what they call hate speech. These are things that Republicans are actually trying to turn into campaign topics and to use to their advantage, just like Democrats are saying our democracy is on the line because of Republicans' illiberal tendencies. Republicans are trying to say that freedom of speech and freedom of thought in schools is also being infringed by Democrats who want to exclude ideas that they disagree with and exclude speech that they disagree with.
Are there precedents for this situation? meaning also that obviously we've seen some tendencies, and we have seen even similarities all around the world.
Right.
You mentioned populism, for example, or other things we have seen recently, not just in the US but all around the world. So are there precedents here? Do we usually forget history and then there come new chapters of absolutely the same story, or this is a new scenario in the political?
Don't get me started on people forgetting their history or not even bothering to learn it. That is a big problem. Democracy, turns out, is very, very fragile. The US is the longest standing democracy in the world, and we've seen authoritarian figures overcome democracies all around the world. It has happened since we've had democracies. In fact, the framers of the Constitution, speaking in the Federalist Papers, Madison and Hamilton, talked about how some of the democratic city-states in Italy after Athens had, of course, they failed because of authoritarian personalities taking over. It is always a fight to keep democracy. Even in our country, our second president, John Adams, supported the Alien and Sedition Acts, which really allowed the government to jail people who were saying things they disagreed with. That happened in our country. And of course, we had the Civil War, right? So people always say it's never been this bad in our country. Well, we did have a civil war. We had people killing each other. So it has been worse. We had an entire group of states secede from the Union and fought an entire war over this, the bloodiest in our nation's history. And during that time, Abraham Lincoln did get rid of the doctrine of habeas corpus, which allows for a timely hearing in front of a judge so that he could jail people who were suspected, not proven, just suspected of being spies for the South. Of course, we have the history of the treatment of African Americans in this country, the denial of their civil rights, the denial of their right to vote, and of course, the internment of people of Japanese ancestry in this country during World War II. So it is always a constant battle to make sure that people's liberties and freedoms are protected in this country, because the tendencies to get behind a strong person, or the tendencies to say, I don't agree with that, you shouldn't say it, or you shouldn't even think it, they're still very strong in people. When we talk about these grand theories and ideas of freedom, and everybody should be able to say what they want, and all this sort of thing, people agree with that in general. But when we get to the specifics, people are a lot more authoritarian than we would think. So to continue the fight is to have free and fair elections and to make sure that people trust them. And that is really something we have to be concerned about this election time around.
Professor, we have 4 minutes left. I would like to add questions of some of our members that we got. So here's one. Does the war in Ukraine and its economic consequences encourage populism movements, and how is it related to the US?
Okay, that is, I will not speak on behalf of populist movements in other countries, because that is not my expertise. There are many other people who've written on this who are much more knowledgeable than I am. But in the United States, because Joe Biden is our commander-in-chief right now, I think that it actually shows that, the enemy is Vladimir Putin. We have a democratically elected president. And so I think the distinction between a Democrat and an authoritarian is pretty stark on the American side. So we really understand that if we had Donald Trump as president and Putin on the other side, things might be a little bit different. And we know that presidents try to accrue more power to themselves during times of war. And that could really open up a little bit more of a chance for authoritarianism in the United States. But I would say right now in the United States, I don't think that the Ukraine war is really playing into it in that regard in terms of authoritarianism. I think it does help Joe Biden and his party help people forget a little bit about the Afghanistan withdrawal, and gives him a little bit more credibility as being a world leader in the way that he's rallied the nations. But Then again, sometimes he's looked a little bit weak, especially with Saudi Arabia cutting the gas supply to the United States. And we'll have to see how our energy bills change within the next few weeks ahead of the elections.
Polling data, what are those predictions of results for the next coming midterm election?
Okay. A lot of us really wanted to get out of the prediction business after 2016 because most of us thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, and a lot of new voters just showed up. We're going to have a lot of new voters this time around. It looks like they're registering Democratic, but we can't be completely sure because of those different rules in different states. If I were betting, and I would say Republicans probably get the House of Representatives. We have a question that we ask people, which is called the generic ballot question, which says, as of today, do you plan to vote for a Democrat or a Republican for the House of Representatives? Republicans have a little bit of an edge there. We would expect it to be about a 10% advantage. It's about 1 to 2% right now. And actually, for a little bit of time, Democrats had an advantage there. We also know that the president's popularity is very closely tied to the results. And as you mentioned earlier, Joe Biden is getting better, but he's still below 50%, which means that the candidates who are running in the House and the Senate on the Democratic Party have to outperform their president. And that is a difficult thing to do. So I don't see the House with all its very gerrymandered districts. I don't see that being retained by the Democrats. I think the Republicans will probably take the House. I think the Democrats save the Senate. I think it's going to be 50 or 51 Democrats. And I think that they're able to retain it, but they're not going to get to that magic 60 threshold.
2 more questions. I think that would be.
Okay.
Do you first want to finish what you were saying? If you remember.
I thought I was just coming to the end of it right there. So I think we can.
I think so too, but
I think we can cut it. Yeah.
Conclude any idea?
I don't think so. I can't even remember what the question is now. What we're talking about.
I'm really sorry about that. We were talking about. Good question.
It was one of the questions you asked about.
Yeah, about the populism. How was it affected in the US? Was that one?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was just saying that democracy is something that we really have to continue fighting for, and we have to fight against illiberal tendencies that have always been there in any democracy. And we need to be careful to make sure that when we see it, we call it out and expose it, and that we support our institutions of democracy.
As an expert professor in mass media and also public opinion, and our members knew that before, they ask, how can we apply both in election terms? In this next election of midterms, but let's also mention the next general election after it.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't ask it very properly, because the question itself is mass media and public opinion. How can we apply both concepts in election terms? So like in general, for example, in this next coming election, when we talk as you as an expert in both things, yeah, in mass media and in public opinion, when you teach that concept in your classes, and we are now getting closer to this election and everything else we need to consider, what does this, public opinion mean specifically? From the investigative and the research, I understand it this way, but maybe I'm getting it wrong.
Okay, I think I can answer this in a way that is helpful. One of the things that we know about the influence of the mass media and public opinion and how it shapes campaigns and elections is that things have become much more digitized. People have gone more to social media and more to informal, instead of watching full newscasts, watching more news clips that they see in social media and the like. And that's where they're getting a lot more of their information. A lot of researchers have been really worried about that because we see this issue of what we call political polarization, where the parties and the members of the parties become much more extreme and don't want to have anything to do with one another. that has to do a little bit with social media, but it also has to do with what we call geographical sorting, where the cities are becoming much more Democratic and everywhere else is becoming much more Republican. And people choose where they live based upon their political affinities in some ways. But on the issue of social media and mass media, the pandemic really made us switch to electronic media to a great degree. We didn't even have our nomination conventions that we usually have in 2020. It was all done digitally. So that was a big missing component of it. Donald Trump's tried to run as much of a regular campaign as he could to try to say that the pandemic wasn't really affecting things as much as it was. And then we saw Joe Biden run, virtually from the basement of his house, as some people were saying. He had a Zoom studio set up there and was running from there, showing that he really took it seriously, the pandemic, that is. And so people have been worried, are we drifting away from each other because of social media? Well, it's kind of complicated because we see that people on social media do interact as much with people of other parties on social media. But the difference is they are more conflictual than they are in real life. People have less interaction in real life when they would be nicer and more polite to each other than they do on social media. On social media, they tend to have more conflictual interactions and they have more of them. So to say that social media has been part of the problem, it has been, but a lot of it is because of how people approach it. People create their own identities about who they are online, and they get into sort of a fighting mode when they get on there, as opposed to, having coffee with somebody or seeing your neighbor. So it's a little bit different that way.
Last question from the audience, and then another one, and we finish. We didn't steal
Okay.
more time, if that's okay.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so you mentioned before, Professor, when we sometimes forget what happened in the past, you mentioned the Civil War. And we as journalists get this sense of a lot of Americans mentioning that, like they have never felt that close to another civil war. We are foreign press correspondents covering a country, a huge country with so many different feelings, and we try to understand how things work differently in every single state, city, and everywhere else. But it is true that there's a common feeling we have seen and we continuously can hear from Americans. Do you think, is that true? Is that a real risk, or is it only a sense of population?
We see more and more people using the search term civil war and geolocated in the United States. So it is a real risk, and it is something that concerns me. We do have some comfort in the fact that we know that the United States armed forces stuck with democracy last time around, and we're not convinced by the generals around Donald Trump. We're not convinced by him, and they were not going to allow him to use the armed forces. But if we start to see members of the armed forces at the top really start questioning the legitimacy of elections and the commander-in-chief, that's when we really start have to worry.
And how dangerous can that be, as a follow-up of the question?
Well, of course, the United States Armed Forces are the best trained and best armed in the world. So it is extremely dangerous. And we are a nation full of guns. So we have a lot of well-armed people. And so to date, we've seen, we saw somebody who go try to attack an FBI office after the search of Mar-a-Lago. So we know that there is a bunch of pent-up frustration and energy and a lot of well-armed people. So it's a deadly combination. We have to be very careful.
And now, as I promised, the last one, as soon as the midterm election finishes, all the attention will be focused on the general election happening 2 years later in 2024.
The primary elections happening in 2024 first, yeah.
Exactly.
Primaries and caucuses, yeah.
Primaries. Yeah, that's true. So that will be the attention put, and what can happen depending on the results on this midterm election, I guess. But what's the next political scenario? There even, people are even, and even the political parties talking about the possibilities of Biden running for the re-election.
Yeah, right.
He should, he shouldn't. So what's the next coming after midterms election?
Okay. Obviously, Republicans are waiting to find out if Donald Trump is going to run. If he's not going to run, we're going to see a lot of Republicans jump in. People like Tom Cotton, Ron DeSantis will jump in. Some may jump in even if he does run, but most will probably not, because Donald Trump is the Republican Party right now. He can command all of the attention, all of the money, and all of the volunteers. On the Democratic side, many people have said that they don't want Joe Biden to run for another term, and he's getting up there in age. But right now, Joe Biden can't say that. And the reason why an incumbent president can't say that he's not running for another term is because people will just abandon ship. They will leave the government. A lot of the best people that he has working for him will decide that they want to run for president, and they will start raising money and volunteers and everything like that. Members of Congress won't work with him anymore because they think he's a lame duck president. So he can't make that, even if he wanted to, he couldn't make that claim right now that he isn't going to run. So I think a lot of people are going to be waiting to find out when he's going to say that, if he's going to say that. But generally, it's not a good idea to run against your own party's incumbent president. Most people who do so don't win.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Todd Belt, Director of the Political Management Program at the Graduate School of Political Management in GW University. Thanks so much for this conversation and helping us understand much better the context previously to this midterm election, but everything else in general. And we will remind you the results.
Okay, let's talk afterwards. Yeah.
Elections.
Okay, we'll see how I did.
We need to update that information and check the results and see what else is coming next.
Okay, great talking with you.